My name is Kelley Vlahos. I am the editor of Responsible Statecraft, which is the foreign policy magazine of the Quincy Institute, which was started in 2020, right before COVID, in an effort to reframe, recalibrate U.S. foreign policy towards diplomacy and away from endless wars and the consensus war thinking of Washington for the last 70 years. I began writing, editing, reporting in Washington in 1999. So my work has spanned all of the recent wars, successive presidential campaigns, everything in between. I'm very much interested in the military-industrial complex and how it's corrupted American society and the polity, and how it promotes endless wars and coercion abroad, and how it works to endanger our freedoms at home. So my talk here today is specifically about the reporting and work that I've done and the work that my organization has done so far in Gaza, but also in the war in Ukraine, and how the dynamics that I talked about, the military-industrial complex, went into overdrive during these wars, and how the government and attending foreign policy establishment, which I call the blob, they say explicitly that it's not an enemies list, but it certainly reads like one. On one slide, they say, most of the subjects in our study have no direct proven ties to the Russian government or propagandists, but the arguments given by many of them, calling on the authorities to distance themselves from Ukraine, repeat the key messages of Russian propaganda aimed at depriving Ukrainians of the opportunity to defend themselves with the help of Western weapons and funds. At that point, they say that any of the 100 or so phrases that they list in this report indicate a desire to shut down support for Ukraine, including such benign and in many cases true things as Crimea is ethnic Russia, Ukraine can't win militarily on the battlefield, the US is at war with Russia, or just the phrase proxy war. All of those phrases reflect in their minds Russian propaganda. The use of them by these groups are Russian propaganda. So as you can see, this is one of the slides, one of the, I don't know if you call them Venn diagrams, but it's novel that many of the names of organizations and people on it from the left and right, and in independent spheres, including the Libertarian Party, Responsible Statecraft, my magazine, Concerned Veterans of America, Cato, Code Pink, the Ron Paul Institute, the Libertarian Institute, and the Libertarian Party, among others. This particular slide was under the rubric of conservative, I can't think it was conservative and libertarian groups, so they have different slides, and others are progressive and left. I wanted to show you this to just show you the lumping, or at least the highlighting of conservative and libertarians. It's a mix of different individuals and groups. Antiwar.com, who I wrote for many years, it's a libertarian anti-war magazine I'm sure you're familiar with. American Conservative, who I also wrote for and worked for years. So obviously, this is not just about highlighting anti-war groups. This runs the gambit. Why is it important that they have so many groups that they're targeting here? Because it looks like they're really desperate. It looks like they lost the narrative. If there's so many groups and individuals that aren't behaving the way they want and talking on point, it seems to me that they're at a loss. And a report like this with a so-called wall of shame indicates the desperation of the blob, the establishment, the pro-Ukrainian agenda. The common thread here is these groups are outside the mainstream of establishment thinking on the issues of Ukraine, and likely represent a growing number of people outside the centers of power, and they're getting nervous. So how did we get here? 2.5 years ago, there weren't as many groups as this that were out there talking outside the mainstream, much less news organizations associated with dissent. Actors like Texty.org set out at the very beginning to ensure that everyone was covering and communicating the preferred narrative of the US policy in Ukraine, which was to support Kyiv at all costs, even if that meant prolonging the war indefinitely, the people and the economy of Ukraine be damned. I can speak for my organization and my magazine to tell you that we have worked very hard not to fall into these traps. And there are many that they have set. Like the catchy title of the preceding slide, where they say these are all groups that are against war aid for Ukraine. I can tell you that any outside contributor to my magazine or staff member has not advocated for turning off the spigot, even though there are groups here that have, but we have not. What we have done is to suggest that further aid is not necessarily going to help Ukraine destroy Russia. If anything, it's going to prolong a war of attrition. So this is one of the first articles that we published after the Russia invasion of Ukraine. Aside from supporting sanctions, limited sanctions on Russia for its illegal invasion of a sovereign nation, our Eurasia director, Anatol Levin, pointed out when it was clear that Putin was not going to be going any further than those eastern states in his conquests, and in fact, Ukraine had already won by preventing Putin from doing so. He pointed this out. From there, we began as an organization from the start to advocate for diplomacy and a path to peace in order to avoid a major conflict that goes beyond Ukraine, involved NATO, involved US, the further destruction of Ukraine. This was our path, this was our principle from the very beginning. As Anatol wrote here, the first is that the United States, Europe, and Ukrainians themselves can agree to a peace settlement along the lines being negotiated without having to fear that this will be a path to Russian domination of Ukraine. Ukrainians have shown that this is impossible. So for the last 18 months, we have not been frightened, however, from saying the following things: that this war cannot be won on the battlefield, that this has turned into a proxy war with Russia, that history matters, that NATO did push Russia into a corner, that we have to talk to Putin, and diplomacy is the only way to end this war. All of that, as you can well imagine, has put a target on our backs. The message management effort by the Western power centers, including the mainstream commentariat and news gatekeepers, have been fierce. One, there is a legion of influencers, ex-trolls, commentators, pundits, and podcasters who have risen up to smack down anyone who questions whether the goal of total annihilation of Russia is in America's best interest. Some have been very nasty and threatening, like the NAFO organization, referred to as the North Atlantic Fella Organization, a Twitter army that grew up in the wake of the Russian invasion and serves like a ratio swarm against anyone who does not toe the line. They clog up your notifications and boast as if they were literally fighting the war themselves. I have been the victim of many NAFO attacks for very benign tweets in support or at least skepticism of US policy in Ukraine. I've been called a tanky, which I'm sure you're familiar with that term as anybody who doesn't support the pro-Ukraine line. I've been called a goblin. I've been called Putin's dick, which I don't understand what that even means. But it's been fierce, and so our mantra, or our sort of credo at Quincy has not been to engage the trolls at all and not give them any oxygen because they literally swarm you, and if you respond, that encourages an even bigger swarm. We try to like not punch down, but as you can see here, it's not just NAFO types and trolls. There are many folks in Washington who will retweet NAFO, but they're from the more establishment, official Washington orbit. They're government officials, former government officials, military types, ex-military, academics are the most insufferable because they're the most sanctimonious. All sorts of bureaucrats, so-called journalists who have thrown all objectivity out at the door and just basically are just retweeting and regurgitating Ukrainian ministry facts and talking points. They've been calling this war the conflict between autocracies and democracies, guilelessly portraying the war as part of the World War II mythology, which would make Putin Hitler, and the Quincy Institute Neville Chamberlain. We've been called that so many times. It's so shop-worn, but it's repeated endlessly. This tweet here they talk about the letter from the Progressive Caucus. So back in 2022, the Quincy Institute was naive enough to think that they could maybe move the needle on Capitol Hill and work with some progressives to urge a more diplomatic path. Never in any instance did we ever suggest to end aid to Ukrainians to defend themselves, but said, let's pair it with a diplomatic strategy. And so we worked with some progressives. We have an advocacy team. They work with some progressive offices to craft a letter that said just that. We support Ukraine. We think the invasion was illegal and awful, all the throat clearing over Putin, but we need to find exit ramps. And it has to be done peacefully. This war isn't going to be won on the battlefield. I don't even know if it went that far. It was released. There was a big splash in the Washington Post. Ooh, progressives are coming out. They're encouraging Biden to do this. And immediately, there was a wave of condemnation from liberal press, liberal influencers, mouthpieces, whatever you want to call them. And by the end of the day, the letter was retracted, and they blamed it on errant staffers who didn't really tell them about it, and they just put it out there. And so the spinelessness of politicians, I mean, we can have a whole other talk about that in Washington. But it just really came forward there, and we learned a lesson. We learned a lesson about who your friends are. You can be anti-war, but there are a lot of people in Washington are only anti-war when it's convenient for them. There's another, let's see. Oh, I have to do this. Okay, here's another guy. So this guy is an academic from the Naval War College. And it's ironic because, he's a blobby professor who wrote a book called Winning the World, Lessons for the Future from the Cold War. He says we're untethered from principle. I mean, what we're getting killed for is sticking to principle, which is that restraint is the only way to end wars and diplomacy to end wars. And that's what we're advocating for here with Ukraine. Just an aside about the Quincy Institute, which he says were an unserious idea from the start, untethered from principle, barely veiled isolationism under the banner of realism or something. When the Quincy Institute was launched in 2022, there was a big buzz because we really wanted to be transpartisan and at every level, at the core, like the DNA. I know there are a lot of places that say they're nonpartisan, but we honestly don't see any way of changing U.S. foreign policy unless we get left and right together and make a serious effort to do that. So our seed money for the think tank was brought in from the Charles Koch Foundation and George Soros's Open Society, and people freaked out, like, how does that even work? But it works in the way that we're not tethered to either side. It's more ideas over ideology. At the time, people like Tom Nichols and progressives on the left liked us because they thought, oh, well, they want to get out of the war in Afghanistan, which we did. They want to start retrenching from the Middle East, which we do. And that was comfort for them. But it turns out that these progressives and liberal, I would call these guys like liberal internationalists, are really humanitarian interventionists. They think and believe that the U.S. should be using military power to solve the problems that they think are worthy. And they think that the war in Ukraine or the invasion of Ukraine kicked off what should have been a U.S. backed intervention or military solution to what was going on in Eastern Europe. They were angry that the Quincy Institute did not see this moment as a justification to support war against Moscow at all costs, that it was indeed a just war. Again, we're trying, this is a clue or is a clarity on who your friends are. They don't really believe in restraint. They just, it's more of an a la carte for them. So we've been getting a lot of shit from people like Tom Nichols. And what bothers us, I guess, is because this guy has like 1 million followers. And and just to give you a little more background, he's one of these people who not only have a very internationalist point of view, but they also have Trump derangement syndrome and Russiagate syndrome. So they can't see beyond that at all. So they see anybody who might be making common cause with conservatives, with MAGA, with Trump people, as somehow being part of a problem. And their problem is illiberalism, the death of democracy, autocracies, you know the whole bit. So these people have been particularly pernicious. This starts creeping into extremism, the use of extremism in the language, and isolationism. The whole use of isolationism is a trigger word. They want, and this is happening all the time, I'm sure you've seen this too, that somehow we're isolationists because we want to engage diplomatically. Well, diplomacy is engagement. Therefore, it can't possibly be isolationism. We want to engage. We just don't want to engage with like bombs. We want to engage with talking. But they use this isolationism as a code word for anti-Semitism, for extremism, for xenophobia. It harkens back to the 1930s and Charles Lindbergh. So this has also been very pernicious in that it is what we call a McCarthyite smear. It's gotten much worse. And we'll talk about that in a second. But as far as the reporting goes, it's been very difficult as a reporter, as an editor who is trying to commission stories, to be able to cover this war with any sort of clarity. As you know, that the mainstream media has been largely about cheerleading for the Ukrainian side, and the US government, the Western powers, the Ukrainian government do not make it easy. They don't provide casualty figures. They don't allow reporters on the front lines. We've had reporters from the Washington Post actually talk to our staff who, by all measure, are just regular on-the-ground straight news reporters and tell us that they have the access to data, to figures, to just basic information is blocked. It's so tightly managed. So it's hard. It's been hard to cover this war from the beginning. And so when you have issues like this, where there has been missile strikes and bridge attacks, the mainstream media rushes to blame Russia. And anybody who suggests maybe we should take a step back and wait till the actual evidence comes out are, again, slammed down as Putin puppets and apologists. And then it turns out, like weeks and months later, oh yeah, it was a stray Ukrainian missile or debris or whatever. And then it gets, I mean, they had like several reporters on this, but by that time the damage is already done. I mean, the initial rush of coverage. The issue of the Azov Battalion, which has been Nazi-linked for years, the mainstream media, before the invasion of Ukraine, had reported. They reported that there were Nazis among neo-Nazis among the Azov Battalion that we were training, that NATO was training. I think it was Time Magazine, the New York Times had stories about this. Well, guess what? After the invasion of Ukraine, all that disappeared. Suddenly, we're supposed to ignore that they had neo-Nazis in their ranks. The reason why they were reporting it pre-invasion was because it fit the narrative of this authoritarian wave in Europe and anti-democracy, and then they tenuously tied it to MAGA back home and Trump. And then when it didn't fit the narrative, it wasn't convenient anymore, all of that disappeared. Well, 2 weeks ago, the Biden administration lifted the ban on the Azov Battalion in terms of them being able to use our weapons because they are so desperate for troops at this point, the Ukrainians are, that we quietly lifted a ban that had been put in place under pressure to arm neo-Nazis. But that just goes to the hypocrisies of our policy. So this was me. I was pushing back on all the smears against Cy Hirsch. As you probably recall, in February 2023, he came out with a Substack suggesting, based on his reporting, yes, it was one source, that the United States Navy had sent a specialized team with the blessing of the Biden administration to sabotage the Nord Stream pipelines. Those pipelines went completely offline in September of 2022. Immediately, Russia was blamed by the media, by US officials, by Western officials for the sabotage, even though it wasn't clear in what interest it was for Russia to blow up its own pipeline. And Cy Hirsch comes out with this bombshell report. Everybody smeared him as a crank, as a loser, as a has-been. Nobody really engaged, except for independent media, in maybe exploring. Like, the US never sabotaged anything, never did covert operations to meddle or destroy or intervene. CIA, nothing. So the mainstream media just went with the official narrative, which we are looking into it. There are investigations, but it is interesting that Ann Applebaum, who is a writer and commentator for The Atlantic, a tried and true neoconservative internationalist who is so pro-Ukrainian, I mean, she's just jumping out of her skin. Her husband, who is a Polish minister, responded like right after the sabotage with this. I don't know if you guys remembered. This completely disappeared from the mainstream note, but this says it all. This, I mean, who knows? But this came out literally right after the sabotage was reported. So a little bit on the investigations. So we know from the Discord leaks last year that the United States, and we don't know because this could be a lot of a shell gaming itself, but that the US was concerned that Ukraine had actually blown up the pipelines, and this was all leaked information. The CIA had warned the Western countries bordering the Black Sea that Ukraine was up to something. They were plotting this is before the sabotage, plotting to blow it up. We never know if they actually listened to the US or what have you, but all of the investigations following have pointed to Ukraine blowing up these pipelines, but one country after another has disbanded their investigation, saying that it's out of their jurisdiction. So my guess is we're never really going to know who blew up those pipelines, but my point is that everybody blamed Russia at the beginning, and reporters who are just so compliant with the blob were just towing the line at the time. I don't have a ton of time, and I want people to be able to ask questions, but I want to just go into the whole disinformation, misinformation, malinformation agenda, and how that has also affected free speech. I don't know if you remember this gal here, Nina Jankowicz, who, I mean, she's just, I don't know how to play videos on this. I'm not very good at slideshows, but I wish I could play this video. I don't know if you guys have seen this TikTok. So she was named the disinformation czar for it was the Department of Homeland Security's Disinformation Governance Board. And she celebrated her appointment and the announcement of this by putting out a TikTok in which she literally put her role as minding our language and our dialogue and the flow of information to the Mary Poppins nanny song, which I just can't wrap my brain about how ironic that is, but it was really cringy. I wish I could play it. The point being that our government felt like it had the authority and it had the sort of capital with the American people to create a disinformation board in which it would be minding our language, how we talk about things, how the media is reporting, social media, and then appoint somebody like this. And not just because she's cringe, but because if you look at her background, she served as a disinformation fellow at the Wilson Center and as supervisor of the Russia and Belarus programs at the National Democratic Institute. She was in Ukraine for a while working with the Ukrainian ministry. I mean, you couldn't cast a better villain in a sort of government coercion plot line than this woman. She's a pure propagandist. Well, she had to resign because there was just such a backlash, and this didn't help, obviously. Now, this came just months before Matt Taibbi reported the Twitter files, which this may be kind of funny, but the Twitter files are not. So basically, he produced reams and reams and reams of data, information that he was able to gather from Twitter that showed that the government, in so many ways that we can't even begin to outline here, had been telling Twitter to shut down accounts, take down tweets. It had various agencies in meetings with Twitter every single day. It got to the point where they had to pay lawyers specifically millions of dollars to interact with Twitter in terms of shutting down and minding the social media information flow during the 2020 election. And it was all about Russia. Russia, Russia, Russia. And as you remember, right before the 2020 election, there were all sorts of CIA, FBI, DHS officials going to Congress and talking about how Russia was intervening again in our elections. And Taibbi shows that this wasn't a matter of them just dropping an email. This was a matter of them persistently intimidating Twitter officials to the point where then there was, and Facebook as well, I didn't get into Facebook, but intimidating to the point where they was chilling their own behavior. So they were preemptively taking down accounts. So this is where the censorship comes from. It's not just about the sort of smearing, which is bad enough, but the outright censorship was going on. Now, we had Matt Taibbi talk to our staff about a month or so ago about this, and one of the things that I wasn't able to ask him is like, okay, so is that still going on today? Because we have a really huge election going on, and it would be interesting to know if the government, the Biden administration, is still, pushing on this. And at the time, and this is an interesting caveat, at the time it was the Trump administration, but it was the Trump administration's own agencies that were working against him in the 2020 election. You know, everybody makes fun of Donald Trump for talking about the deep state, but I mean, this was the deep state that was working at odds with his administration and his re-election efforts. Okay, and then one of the worst things that I've encountered as an editor is the smearing of so-called pro-democracy or by pro-democracy or anti-authoritarian voices who are pushing this idea that global freedom is on the line, and if you don't believe that Russia should be completely destroyed, you're somehow on the side of autocrats and illiberalism. Any conservatives like Tucker Carlson are really just secret Nazis who just love Putin and his white Christian ethno-nationalism. They don't care about Ukraine or restraint or anything like this. So again, it's the smearing, and even Biden himself is participating in this. So this speech that he gave just before the 2022 midterms, in which he's in Philadelphia flanked by two Marines, looks a little fascistic to me. He's talking about, well, here's his quote: MAGA promotes authoritarian leaders, and they fan the flames of political violence that are a threat to our personal rights, the pursuit of justice, to the rule of law, to the very soul of this country. So what does that say? He's giving a speech right before a midterm domestic election and signaling at the same time that if you don't support full-throated his policies overseas, that you're MAGA, because MAGA promotes these authoritarians overseas. What does this have to do with the domestic election? Well, he's mixing it all up. He's mixing foreign policy with domestic policy. I don't know if it works, but to me, this is a chill, because this chills independents, this chills progressives who might be rethinking Biden's policies, and they go, I don't want to be associated with MAGA. I don't want to be associated with Donald Trump. I better toe the line. So, I mean, I just want to get through, on the bottom line of the Ukraine war, the Quincy Institute and all these groups that we saw in that first slide have been more or less vindicated, not really feeling vindicated, because Ukraine is a mess right now. It's being destroyed. They've bled population. These pro-democracy warriors keep wanting to throw more guns into the fight, but they don't have the soldiers to fight it. Biden's still using it as a leverage for his re-election campaign. He doesn't want to have any defeat before November. Then you got this NATO summit coming in Washington where they're going to be kumbaya-ing about how they need to infuse energy in the idea that the alliance is pro-democracy. And the mainstream media is still pretty much a slave to the to the message management. So, yeah, we might have been right about how these things were going to turn out, but it doesn't feel very good because the Ukrainian people are suffering. So, covering Israel-Gaza, this is basically what my organization and Responsible Statecraft are, the tenets, what we believe in regarding this war, that we need a ceasefire. The deliberate blocking of food and aid and bombing hospitals and shelters is collective punishment. Israel's continuing destruction of Gaza is risking a wider Middle East war that will put our troops at risk and our military at risk that's in the region, and that Biden hasn't used any of his leverage. $4 billion a year going to Israel, all to its military, by the way. That's not humanitarian. It's not for economic development. And Biden won't use it to ensure that civilians aren't being killed, that there is an ethnic cleansing or genocide. So this is what we believe. But we've been very targeted. Again, there are many traps laid out for this kind of reporting. So we've talked about the military-industrial complex and how it's a boon. So Biden wants to engage in an industrial policy now, which is a complete give to the defense industry. They're getting everything they want right now. So we're building up for Ukraine, and now we're building up for Israel. We paid for $320 million to build a pier floating off the coast of Gaza, and then a trident pier anchored to the beach in Gaza. It fell apart. Why did we build it? What was that all about? Like, we have the leverage to tell Netanyahu to open up the gates to let aid through. So Biden decides to make a big splash and say the U.S. military is going to go in there and surge, like it was Iraq, surge humanitarian aid, and then it didn't work, which makes us look like fools. And again, Biden okays more arms to Israel. Even just this week, it was reported that the Democrats caved on approving $18 billion worth of F-15s to Israel that they want desperately. What kind of message is this to Israel? They get to do whatever they want because the American taxpayer will just keep giving them everything they want. And then there's the hypocrisy. We have people like Ann Applebaum marching around saying we are the leader of the global rules-based order. And then the UN finds that the criminal court finds that there may be genocide happening, tries to push a ceasefire, and we say, nah, I don't think so. We don't think that's happening. But there's genocide going on in Ukraine, according to the Biden administration, but not Israel. So there's so many hypocrisies that the rest of the world sees that they know that this is all bullshit, that there's no such thing as the U.S. being a moral leader. Now, probably all of us in this room know that it was bullshit from the beginning. We've known that since, like, the Cold War, Vietnam, but it's so, like, in stark relief right now that we have lost any of our credibility. And this, again, superpower, I mean, it just exposes us for what we really are. And then I'm just going to talk a little bit here. So we spent the last 2 years talking about Russian disinformation and intervening in our politics. There is a propaganda machine, dwarfs anything that Russia is doing. Plus, they have AIPAC on Capitol Hill, which is basically threatening members of Congress that if they even dare withhold aid from Israel or push any anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian agenda, that they will be primaried. Just ask Tom Massey. They went after that poor guy, and guess what? Didn't work, because he won his primary with 70% of the vote. And I love that guy because he's been one of the few people that's gone out there and talked about how pernicious that AIPAC is. And then here, right after October 7th, you had a WhatsApp chat log or WhatsApp chat group that basically included every tech and media mogul in, every major tech investor, media mogul, network CEOs, you name it, all hanging out on this chat group, taking orders from the IDF on how to wage an information war here in the United States. What does that mean? It means if somebody said something pro-Palestinian on a network or in a university executive office or wherever on the media, they would swarm in and make sure those people got fired, deplatformed. These protests on the university campus, they didn't just, the protests may have happened organically, but the rush that shut them down to expose their presidents, to drag them into Congress for hearings, that did not happen organically. A lot of this happened because of the major media influence and tech influence in this country. It is all geared to supporting Israel. That is not a conspiracy theory. I'm sure there are people in Congress who call me anti-Semitic for even saying that, but it's true. And we got to watch out for this because this is chilling our speech. So I'm just going to end with this a quote from John Quincy Adams, for which my organization was named after. Like I said earlier, you don't have to agree with me in terms of like the conflicts and whether or not we should be supporting, the prolonged war in Ukraine or Israel. What I'm afraid of is that the chill on our free speech, independent reporting. We continue to support wars abroad. It endangers our freedoms at home. It sounds cliche, but it's real, and that's happening. You can just ask, people like Julian Assange, other truth tellers. It's about retribution. It's about chilling of speech, deplatforming. We've seen it, we saw it with the vaccines. We didn't even get into that because I was kind of focused on Ukraine and Israel. But we definitely saw that with vaccines, and I'm sure there are plenty of people talking about that here at PorcFest. But the bottom line is that when we let this happen, we're no better than these autocracies that we're supposedly fighting overseas or railing against. So with that, I'll take some questions. I'm sorry if I talked too long.
No, it's not. Okay.
Now it is.
Now it's okay. Sorry. So the very specific question. So there were 4 pipelines. 3 were destroyed, which would imply there's an unexploded device, I would think. I read somewhere that a Swedish official reported that the United States immediately came in and seized that device. I read that in Substack. I can't remember where. It would seem an obvious point. You go in and seize that. I've heard nothing else about it. Have you heard anything about it?
I haven't heard that. I haven't heard that. I mean, the last thing that I have heard was that and this is off your point, but that there was a special forces guy in the Ukrainian military who's been thrown into jail for perhaps leading, he was thrown into jail for something else. But he's been fingered as the ringleader or the mastermind. So they're throwing their own people under the bus because he's not attached to Zelensky, though he's in his government. That's the last I heard. When I said that these fingers are pointing to Ukraine, I haven't seen anything about that. All the reporting is that it's zeroing in on Ukraine, whether it be special forces. They had this incidents where they had rogue anti-Russian, I don't know if they were Ukrainians or Russians, I don't know, but had taken a boat and somehow divers, and they were the culprits, and of course they had no government, which is convenient. Right. But no, I haven't heard about this like unexploded device.
I would think there would be one, or why not?
Yeah, on this cover up front, one thing I noticed with talking with some lefty friends, I think it was last year when the guy from Joint Base Cape Cod had that slide deck showing that everything about the Ukraine propaganda was a lie. and then the entire media organization like helped the government hunt this guy down and suppress it. It was like blatant, like they were just agents of the state. I mean, you work in media, like what was that? And is like, have they just given up all pretense of independence? And I'm just surprised we haven't heard more about that. And like that slide deck, no one else has leaked it. Like
It's a circling of the wagons, like in real, like in its purest form. I don't know much about what happened with that slide deck, and all I know is like when you look at the Nord Stream pipeline, when you look at the reporting of the Twitter files by Matt Taibbi, what does the mainstream media do? Do they rush to say, "Hey, Matt, he's one of us. He's a journalist. Let's follow up on his reporting and put stories in our papers too"? Everything was about how to discredit Matt, how to discredit Cy, how to discredit probably the guy that put out that slide. Matt Taibbi is one brave son of a gun, because he was dragged into Congress in hearings just so he could be slapped around by people. I think it was Debbie Wasserman Schultz for some, and they sicked the IRS on him. I guess they did an audit. I mean, this guy was targeted. Why? Because he was doing his job. And one of the things that struck me about Matt when talking to him is that he said, "I've always done my job this way. I'm a reporter. And everybody loved me when I was reporting what a crazy circus the Trump administration was." He did a whole book on it. And he's in Rolling Stone, and everybody loves him because he's calling out Republicans and he's calling out MAGA. And the Russiagate thing started, started gaining steam, and he realized that things weren't adding up, that Democrats were making all sorts of arguments about the Steele dossier and about connections between Trump operatives and Putin. And he realized that, he sensed that these Democrats were getting over their skis about it. And he goes to his editor at Rolling Stone and he says, "I really want to follow this up. I think that there's something here. There's things that aren't adding up. I'm feeling like there's just like this machinery that's just gearing up to discredit Trump, but there's just no there." And they said no. And he said it was the first time that he ever asked to do a story from his editors at Rolling Stone in like 15 years, because he had been writing, where he's been told no. And it became clear to him that, this wasn't about independent journalism. This wasn't even really about journalism. This is about political agenda-driven reporting, writing, commentary. And he's a casualty of that, because once he started going off script, then the entire Borg circled and went after him. So I just think that that's what you're seeing, unfortunately.
Well, I think people are seeing it though. Like all my friends across the spectrum are seeing that it's all fake and it's all propaganda.
Yeah.
So, and the work you're doing is really helping that too.
Well, one of the things that's always bothered me is after Trump won, and the Democrats were just trying to figure out how to get rid of him and delegitimize him. I heard this NPR story where they said, "Oh, all these kids are now joining journalism programs at their colleges because they want to be journalists." And why do they want to be journalists? And they, stick the microphone in their face and say, "Well, I want to go after Donald Trump. I want to expose Donald Trump." Like, their only reason for getting into journalism was a political agenda. Like, they didn't see journalism as just the idea that you go after a story no matter where it is, because your role is informing the American public and being a conduit of information no matter what, whether it hurts this side or that side. They just saw it purely as like, "Oh, well, I got to go after Donald Trump."
So my question is very general, but I've never been able to get a good answer to it. Why Russia? If you list all 200 countries in the world, Russia, in terms of the quality of its democracy, in terms of its economy, in terms of its internal rights for citizenship, citizens, in terms of like its belligerence, it maybe ranks somewhere between like 50 and 120. Like it's certainly not the worst on like any metric that like we'd consider for like, oh, I wouldn't want to live there. And if like, is it just wag the dog like, oh, the war in Afghanistan ended and now we need another war that we can pump billions of dollars into? Is it just they're the only white Christian country that now doesn't support gay marriage?
Yeah.
It just seems inherently farcical that like this is about $400,000 in Facebook ads in 2016.
I totally agree, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but there are so many layers to it. I think that there is a massive overhang from the Cold War. So you have tons of people in Washington who were schooled in, have cut their teeth in the Cold War, whether it be like they, were in government during the 80s and 90s, they're in government now. My husband's back there, he can tell you better. The entire orbit of Russian experts in the 1980s had been taken over by neoconservatives. Any think tank, your prestige foreign policy schools where they were pumping out PhDs were all about neoconservative, anti-Russia agendas. And so you don't have people who understand Russia, have empathy for Russia, want to understand Russia. Everything is geared to hating Russia, and a little bit might be the anti-Eastern Orthodox. It might be the fact that he is one of the few European leaders who don't kowtow to Brussels. It might be the anti-communist overhang. There's a lot going on there, but I'm with you. I don't think the American people fully grasp, but I think that the Democratic Party was able to build this idea that somehow Trump was a puppet of Putin, that Putin helped him win the election in 2016, took it away from Hillary Clinton, built up this entire argument with bad data, poorly evidenced briefs against him, and they sold it for a little while. They impeached him over it in the House. So I think that there's just a lot of derangement syndrome, a lot of anti-Russia syndrome that's still going on, but I think that the Ukraine war, and I think, like you said, people are waking up to it and are not as manipulated, and they're seeing clearly what's going on. I think I can only take one more question or two, right? Okay.
So I want to preface this question with a quote from Yuri Bezmenov, where he said that ideological subversion is the first part of the war. And in that is you demoralize the person first. So I want to ask you, how much of this war do you think is spiritual, and how much of this war can only be fought from that standpoint?
With the Ukraine war?
Both of them.
What do you mean by spiritual? Like, in terms of like philosophical
Good
or
and evil.
Existential?
Straight up
good and evil. I think they want us to believe it's a war between good and evil, but I think as we're cluing into, I think there's political agendas here that have nothing to do with good and evil, because if it had to do with good and evil, why aren't we fighting Saudi Arabia? I mean, Mohammed bin Salman he had Jamal Khashoggi dismembered, okay? But yet we are about to give him a defense treaty and nuclear power. That doesn't compute. So we know it goes beyond the spiritual, like you said, or ideological. This is about politics, unfortunately. I'm sorry. Okay.
I want to say thank you to Kelley for kicking off Thursday here in the pavilion.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.